These notes will focus on the history of Mexico. The very first Mexicans, again, just like the last two places that we talked about, came across that land bridge up in Alaska, connecting Alaska to Russia, and then kind of filtered down throughout North and South America. And so thousands and thousands of years ago, the very first Mexicans were hunters and gatherers. So they were looking around for meat, for animals, and hunting that, and then gathering whatever food was naturally growing wherever they were. But about 7,000 years ago, they started to find this wild grass called maize, and what they decided to do was develop it and start to take the seeds and plant it themselves. And so that was really the beginning of agriculture, the very first farming that happened in North and South America. And maize is just another word for corn. And so maize was the very first crop grown in the Americas, and later on we would go to call it corn. So that's where agriculture started. Now, as farming started to increase, so did the population, and people started to grow different things. They started to grow beans and started to grow squash and chili peppers and a lot of these things that you see in Mexican dishes today because they've been around that region for a very long time. And so that first civilization happened or started to rise in about 1500 BC. So that's all the way back 2016 years ago, back to zero, and then 1500 more years back. Okay, and it rose on the Gulf Coast, so the east side of Mexico, where the Gulf of Mexico is. And this is kind of the very first civilization, the very first society in Mexico. And we know a couple things about them, but we don't know a whole lot of specifics because it was so long ago and they didn't keep really good records. But first off, they had a political system. We know that. We're not exactly sure how it worked, but we're pretty sure that their art here, this top right corner, okay, this head here, they were really giant heads carved out of stone, and what we think is that these are probably statues of their leaders. So they probably had some sort of a situation where there was one ruler who was in charge of all of them. They also developed their own religion. They developed their own writing, and their writing was a form of hieroglyphics. You've heard of hieroglyphics, and you probably think, oh, that's Egypt, right? Well, it's not just Egypt. Hieroglyphic just means that you have pictures or symbols that stand for certain words. And so instead of like our writing, where our symbols, like a A or a B or a C, is a symbol that stands for a letter or a part of a word, the hieroglyphics is a symbol that stands for an entire word. And so you can see some of their writing, which really wasn't like writing on paper. It was carved into stone, but these are their symbols. And the last thing they did is develop trade with nearby people. And so they started to trade their goods and get the goods that they wanted. And what this did is it influenced future societies and kind of built the new societies in the image of the Olmecs. The next great civilization in Mexico was the Mayan civilization. And the Mayan civilization was in southern Mexico and mostly on the Yucatan Peninsula. It was also in some Central American countries, but in Mexico, these were the regions where you saw them. They built many, many cities throughout this area with like thousands of people in each city, so pretty big cities. In each of these cities, they had a temple to their gods, and the temple was a stepped pyramid. So if you can see right here on this picture, there's kind of these huge steps, and those are how the pyramid was created. So instead of just going straight up flat, it was step, 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 step down. Okay, and so these pyramid-shaped temples were to honor their gods, and they were decorated with sculptures. And one of the big things that they liked to decorate with was a snake head. The snake was revered as a god in their religion. And so you can see down here, it's really quite large because those people are standing right next to it. So it's big, but from this angle, it's hard to see. That is a snake head at the bottom of each stair. And so they had these snake heads, which was kind of interesting, and we'll talk about why later. But they also were really strong in astronomy. There was, I visited this city of Tenoch, or not Tenochtitlan, Chichen Itza, sorry, the Mayan city of Chichen Itza, and I saw, this building, and I also saw an as observatory, so a place where they would go and they would study the stars and the sun and all of that kind of stuff, everything out in space. And so what they did is they had these little slots to look through, and they kind of studied how they moved and where they were and all that kind of stuff. And so they would look out of these slots, they would record it at different hours, different times of the year, and they would kind of have an idea of where they were in space. And so what they were able to do was use that understanding to build calendars and to build really, really accurate calendars. Mayan calendars were very accurate. And this is a picture of the Mayan calendar. Okay, but it's kind of interesting because they used this calendar to guide the farmers when to plant what, and so they used it for agricultural purposes, and they also used it for religious purposes, because one of their biggest, or actually two of their biggest ceremonies happened on the equinox, when the sun was directly over the equator, because that's pretty close to them. And what they did is they knew exactly where that sun was going to be because of their astronomy, and so they set it up so that each of their temples here, and this is a picture of it again up here, okay, this pyramid, on the equinox, you can see that the shadows of the sun would hit at exactly the right space to put a body on that snake during their special festival. So you can kind of see right there, the sunlight makes it look like a snake body climbing down from the top of their temple. So kind of interesting. It just shows you how much they knew about astronomy. And then at the bottom, it looks like it's cut off here, but it essentially just says that even though the civilization declined in 908 AD, there are still many Mayan people living, especially in the Yucatan Peninsula today. After the fall of the Mayans, the Aztecs took over in about the 1400s AD. And so in the 1400s AD, the Aztecs rose up to the major power. And so they rose up in the Valley of Mexico, where Mexico City is today. And so where Mexico City is today, there was a capital city of the Aztecs called Tenochtitlan. This is the one I messed up on before when I was talking about Chichen Itza, but this is Tenochtitlan, and Tenochtitlan was the capital of the Aztec Empire, and it was built on an island. You can see the picture up here. It was built on an island in the middle of the lake. And what they did is they built these land bridges. So they just brought dirt and dirt and dirt and dirt and built these dirt roads where you could get off of that island. But what that did, if you're in the middle of a lake, it made it really easy to defend, because any ground troops that were coming had to come over that one land bridge. And so it was really hard to send like hundreds of thousands of troops after somebody if you only can send them 4 wide at a time. That makes it really, really difficult to attack anybody. So it was kind of like a giant moat around their entire city. And it was the largest city ever built by natives in North and South America. And so there was 150,000 people that lived there. And the Aztecs had a lot of skills. They were very skilled farmers. They would grow the same things like squash and corn and beans and chili peppers. They were also very skilled engineers. As engineers, they built both aqueducts and canals. And aqueducts are kind of this picture right here, but they are these channels that they would carry fresh water from wherever it was to wherever they needed it, so that they could have fresh water for all 150,000 people in these huge cities. They had to move the water to the place where it was most convenient for people to use. And then the canals, we already know what a canal is. A canal is a river that humans dig out and make their own river, and so that was used for transportation, for moving around from place to place. And so they had many aqueducts and canals, and by the end of the Aztec Empire, they had conquered and controlled about 5 million people. So the Aztecs were in charge of 5 million natives in Mexico at the time. Then came the conquistadors, and a conquistador is a Spanish soldier explorer. And the Spanish soldier explorers, or the conquistadors, came in to colonize America, to take it over, take the land for Spain, and make new cities, new communities there, so that honestly they could take the resources, the gold and silver and all that kind of stuff from Mexico, and send it back to Spain and make a whole bunch of money. But when they got over there, they immediately heard stories of the Aztecs and this huge society, and they said they had huge cities just full of gold and silver. And so the Spanish decided, if there's these giant cities full of gold and silver, maybe we should go find these people and try and get some of that gold and silver. And so in 1519, Hernan Cortez came over to Mexico. Okay, and Hernan Cortez was the conquistador who fought against the Aztecs, and he only had with him 500 soldiers. And so they pulled up to Mexico in their ships, and then they got off of them, and then they burned their ships sitting there. Okay, and what he was saying is, we're gonna fight, and we're gonna fight to the end because we got nowhere to go back to. We're gonna do as much as we can to take over this land. This is our new home. We don't need these ships to go back. And so him and his 500 soldiers, it only took them about 2 years to defeat the Aztecs. And remember, the Aztecs had 5 million people on their side, 5 million people in their control. Tens of thousands of Aztecs died, and the conquistadors and Hernan Cortez ended up destroying Tenochtitlan and building Mexico City. How did they do it? How did 500 people beat 5 million people? How did 500 people even beat the 150,000 people that were on Tenochtitlan itself? Well, what ended up happening is Hernan Cortez and the Europeans brought disease, and that disease killed a lot of people, a high percentage of people, like maybe 80 to 90% of the people were killed from disease. The people of the Aztecs kind of wanted peace with these people. They saw them and they thought, wow, their technology is really good. Maybe we can get something from them. We can start trading with them. And so they wanted peace, and Hernan Cortez kind of took advantage of that, tricked them. And then the Spanish people had better weapons as well. They had steel. And then last but not least, probably the most important one actually, is that those 5 million people that had been conquered by the Aztecs, they weren't really that happy. They weren't happy to be part of the Aztec Empire. And so they actually joined Hernan Cortez and fought against the Aztecs to try and get free from the Aztecs. So as the Spanish people came in and ended up taking over this land of Mexico, they made some pretty big changes. And the biggest change was kind of how society worked. Before, everybody was a Native American, everybody, kind of had their place in society. Some of them were better off, some of them were worse off. But when the Spanish came in, they decided that they would be the highest people in society. So they'd have the most influence, they'd be the richest, they'd be the ones that everybody has to listen to. And so the Spanish people had the highest place in society, and the natives had almost no rights. Oftentimes at the beginning especially, they were used as slaves, the natives were, and so they forced them to work. But also the other type of person that came over, other than the Spanish rulers, was the priests. And a lot of Roman Catholic priests came over, and their goal was to try to convert the natives. So they were called missionaries. Missionaries are people that go places trying to convert people from their religion to a different religion. And so they were trying to convert the natives, trying to make them change their religion into being a Roman Catholic. And so at this time, what they would do is they'd set up these missions, they'd set up these churches, and basically the church was almost like a mini fort. It had high walls and it was safe and all that kind of stuff. And so people that were afraid or being chased or anything like that, just wanted some shelter for the night or anything like that, would see these missions and they would go into them, and it would be okay for you to stay as long as they could talk to you about their religion and maybe changing your religion over and try and pressure you into that. And so these churches became really important. They became seen as a place of safety. And so what ended up happening is cities became or started to be built around them. Okay. And so when these cities were built around them, they really took on this place of power because they were the start of the city. And so oftentimes the church officials became the leaders of the entire community, all right, as they're slowly converting the native population over to Roman Catholicism. As Spain started to weaken and weaken their grip on South America and on Mexico and on all this land that they got right away really, really quickly, they decided they wanted to kind of try and change things to make Mexico happy. And so they did that. They tried to improve the conditions and make the people of Mexico happy so that they were happy with Spain and not wanting to fight against them. And their goal was to increase trade. And so they did. They increased trade, and with all these different laws that allowed the Mexicans to trade with other people, it brought the economy back in Mexico. And so they were making a whole lot more money. And so Spain thought, well, we helped them out, so now they can help us out. And so what Spain did is raise taxes on those Mexican people, and they sent in new people over to rule Mexico and to basically enforce those taxes that they had just made up. And so obviously the Mexicans were happy that they had brought the economy back, but they were mad that now they were trying to take their money because they were the ones that had worked for it. And so they did not like the raise in taxes. And so the Mexicans were thinking of this and upset about this, and they saw what the Americans were doing with their revolution, and the Enlightenment was happening all across Europe. And so people were saying, why are the kings in charge? Why are they in charge? Why aren't the people in charge? And we all have these certain rights and we're not getting them. And so the Mexicans started to think, well, we're not getting our natural rights either. We're not getting life, liberty, and property. We're not getting those same rights that everybody else is fighting for. And so they thought, well, maybe we should have our natural rights too. Maybe we should try and fight for freedom against Spain. So at the same time this was happening, Napoleon was fighting in Europe, and we've talked about him before, but Napoleon, he had taken over, he was a French leader, but he had taken over Spain. And when he took over Spain, he didn't just say this is part of France. He kept it as Spain, but he put his brother in charge, and his brother sent a new person over to rule in Mexico and try to help out and listen to the Mexicans and figure out whatever he could do to fix it. Okay, but it was too late, and in 1810 the Mexicans launched a revolution, and they fought against the Spanish rulers, and it was a war that lasted about 11 years, and they finally gained their own independence from Spain in 1821. However, the problem is, and this is the problem still with Mexico today, is they kind of got a slow start, because unlike America, which got a really fast start because they had George Washington in charge, with everybody loved and everybody thought he was great, and everybody wanted to listen to him, and everybody would follow any rules that he put down. It wouldn't bother them. Okay, just honestly, everybody loved George Washington. Mexico didn't have that kind of a person. And so what Mexico had was a whole bunch of different people who people kind of agreed with, and they were kind of fighting each other for power. So while they did write a constitution like the US did, what happened inside of it and after it is there were a bunch of different leaders trying to get power from each other and fighting each other, and trying to fight for whatever. And so the government was completely unstable and weak for decades and decades. And so the people were kind of running it, which when the people run it, the rich people get more power and the poor kind of get left out. So in the mid 1800s, they finally got a strong leader by the name of Benito Juarez, and Benito Juarez was trying to help the poor people. He was trying to help the poor as much as possible, and so he promised that he would break up these large farms that were owned by the rich people and try and give that land out to the poor farmers. Try and kind of I guess spread the wealth a little bit. So take some of the wealth of the rich people and give it to some of the poor people and help everybody out. But that doesn't help the rich people out, and the rich people were mad. And so they went over to France, some of the rich people, and they said, can you help us out because we're being treated bad by our government? And so the French sent an army, and that army, that French army, defeated Juarez. And then the French put an Austrian noble guy right here, this guy, okay, in charge. His name was Maximilian. And Maximilian, while he has an awesome beard, couldn't get very much done. He tried to bring peace, he wanted to bring peace, but Juarez's supporters just kept fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting. And so years of fighting ended up putting Juarez back in charge. But Juarez still couldn't make the reforms that he wanted because the rich were constantly resisting him all throughout the time that he was in power. So after Benito Juarez from 1870s to 1911, there was one very, very powerful person in charge who started out trying to help and ended up abusing his power in the end. His name was Porfirio Diaz, and this is a picture of Porfirio Diaz. Okay, and Porfirio Diaz decided at first he was going to try to put Juarez's reforms through. He's going to try and help those poor people by doing all of the things that Juarez had wanted to do. And he was also going to build the economy, and the way that he decided he was going to build the economy and try and get people more money is to invite foreign people, so maybe people from America, people from England, people from Spain, anybody from another country who had more money to come in and build companies and build railroads there. And he thought if we could build up the infrastructure and we could build up our business here in Mexico, then our economy will get much, much better. And so the economy started to get better. That's true. The Mexican economy started to get better, but most of the people that were benefiting from it were the owners of these businesses. And the owners of these businesses were in another country. And so the rich people that had come in from another country to build the companies there were making a whole lot of money, but the poor workers there were still living in really, really nasty poverty and having a hard time making it from day to day. And so Porfirio Diaz just kept going until about 1911, about 1910. And in 1910, what ended up happening is Diaz wasn't trying to be the president anymore, but he had a candidate that he wanted to be the president. So he was pushing for people to elect this other guy, and he ended up losing that election. His guy ended up losing the election. And so what Porfirio Diaz did, because he had so much power in the country, is he had the winner arrested, and he made his candidate the president instead of that other guy who had actually won in the right way. And so people were mad about this. They said, you can't be a dictator. We want a democracy. We voted for this guy. And so the Mexican Revolution came after that. And it was from about 1910 to 1917 for about 7 years. It was this period of time when the people were fighting back, and they were fighting against the army, and it was an armed rebellion. And so they ended up fighting for the political and social reforms at this time. So in 1917, a new constitution was written to try and kind of solve all these problems. And so what the Constitution of 1917 did is it made the government way more responsible for improving Mexican lives. It says your main reason for existing is to improve Mexican lives, people here actually in Mexico. And some of the major goals within that Constitution were, again, to give land to those poor farmers who were barely surviving, and to give more rights to the poor workers who were working in factories and places like that. And so at this time, the changes to the old Constitution and changes to this Constitution were then promised, but they never happened. And it ended up with the government being overthrown again. And so, again, over and over and over, ever since the beginning of the country of Mexico, there's been this struggle for power, and it still has never stopped. And so really in Mexico up to today, the poor still have a very, very hard time. They still continue to suffer and struggle to survive in Mexico.